Hi everybody, I'm Henry Badgery and I want to welcome you back to another episode, our second episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams, the open source services marketplace where users of open source software can find, vet, and contract with service providers. In this episode, we talk with Jono Bacon. Jono is one of the world's leading experts when it comes to building strong open source software communities. In this episode, we'll be discussing topics such as what is the role of a community manager and why is community so important? How do you build and grow an open source community around a company project that you've released to the world and open sourced? What are some best practices for contributing back to open source communities that you rely on? And how do you actually measure the ROI of your contributions? And last but not least, how to harness the power of an inner source culture within your organization. So are you ready? Let's dive right in. And I am super excited to welcome our guest for this episode, Jono Bacon. Jono has helped to build open source communities for nearly 20 years and was the director of community at Github, Canonical, XPRIZE, and Open Advantage. And he also started Jono Bacon Consulting, which provides community strategy and execution, developer workflow, and other services. He is also the author of the book People Powered: How Communities Can Supercharge Your Businesses, Brand, and Teams. So if you're an enterprise and you're wanting to learn how to build communities and leverage communities, either within your organization or outside of your organization, then I highly recommend reading this book. And if that's not enough incentive to get the book today, then I want to tell you about this initiative that Jono started up recently, the People Powered Book Club. It's completely free. All you have to do is buy the book and you'll come together virtually every week. The task is to read a chapter of the book a week and you can come together and discuss the topics that you learned and read about and also ask Jono questions. So what better way to learn something in a book than to learn it with the author? So that is great. But there is a deadline. The 2nd of October is the last day that you can sign up to the book club. So make sure you go to Jono's website, jonobacon.com/books/peoplepowered/club. Jono is also very generously offering 2 free chapters of his book, People Powered, both in audio and PDF version, where he will also read the audio himself. You can find free content, free training, and much more at his website, jonobacon.com/pact. So now that the introductions are out of the way, Jono, thank you so much for joining us.
That's the best intro ever. You got all of the links out. My website's going to be flooded with your listeners. I love this. You're a pro.
Thank you. Not as much of a pro as you. I know you run a few podcasts, so I'm really excited to be able to talk to you. And I thought to kick off, I know that in a global world of open source, if anyone mentions the word community or they ask, how do you build one? Your name seems to be the first or one of the first to come up. So can you take us back a bit and explain how you got here today?
Yeah, I remember it pretty vividly. I was 18, living at home with my parents. I had, believe it or not, long hair, which started growing inwards when I was about 21 and coming out my back. My brother came to stay with us for a couple of weeks, my older brother Simon, and I was moaning about Windows or something like that. I was getting really interested in technology, but I was also really into music as well. And I was kind of debating whether I wanted to pursue a career in music or a career in tech. Anyway, so he came back and he said, you should try Linux. And this was back in 1998. So this was very much in the early days of Linux and open source. And he basically installed Slackware 96 on my machine, put a Post-it note on the monitor with the username and password and left. And didn't just like dual boot it. It replaced Windows. That's all I had. So I was kind of forced into figuring out how to make this work. And I used to work in a bookshop, and there was only really, I think, at that time, one book on the market about Linux. So I went and bought this book with my 10% staff discount, and the first chapter of the book talked about how people around the world come together to make Linux, and they work on the internet, and they collaborate, and they share the fruits of that labor, which is Linux itself. And that was just, it sounds like a horrible cliche, but that really was a light bulb moment for me. I was just fascinated with the idea of that. I was already fascinated with the concept of the internet, because I don't know what it was like in Australia back then, but certainly in England, the internet wasn't very pervasive, because you had to pay 10 pence a minute to get online. It wasn't like in the US where all the colleges were online and all the rest of it.
I think in Australia it was still that till probably 10 years ago. We've had terrible internet.
Yeah,
notorious.
Exactly. A lot of Americans don't realize just how good they had it.
No, you're getting 100 MBS. I got that at university. I had to go to university to get that.
Same here. I remember going to like my girlfriend, her mum worked at a university, and I remember downloading like the 40 floppy disks of Slackware to get an update. Anyway, I was just captivated by it. The tech was interesting to me, but I just really wanted to understand how the community thing worked. And really it was just a slippery slope from there. I built a community in the UK called Linux UK, got to meet some really cool people, and just found that a lot of open source people they were my people. I didn't know it at the time. And it really was, I feel extremely fortunate. I would not have the life I have today, which I'm very happy, if it wasn't for open source.
That's amazing. So at that point, was it the hackers, or what was an everyday open source Joe?
Yeah, I mean, it was very male. There were a sprinkling of women here and there, but it was a very male-dominated environment, which obviously has been a real problem. And thankfully, I think it's getting better now, the diversity levels.
Yes.
A lot of developers. What was really interesting for me is that I'm really proud to come from England, because England was kind of early in the open source world, I think. And there was a very, very tight-knit community of people in the UK. And they were developers, and primarily developers and sysadmins. I'd never even heard of the concept of a community manager back then. It didn't exist as far as I was aware. In fact, the first time I heard the words community manager was when I heard about the job at Canonical, where I went to go and work. But what was cool is there was an event in the UK called the Linux Expo, which took place at the Olympia in Kensington. And my friends and I would go down to the event and basically go and wander around. But the reason why we went down was not for the event, it was for the pub at the end of the first couple of days.
Very English.
And in that pub was just like, there were a group of people that I still know and friends with today. I mean, people who are many of which have had really promising careers, like John Masters, who's kind of a bit of a guru when it comes to ARM, Matthew Garrett, who's a legend in the Linux kernel world, Scott James Remnant, who was a legend in the Debian world. We'd all hang out down the pub and just make bad jokes and have fun with each other, and a really close friendship formed. It wasn't just about the tech, and I think that's what made it so special for me. Was this wasn't just interesting. It wasn't an academic thing, because I'm not an academic. It felt right. And that was so exciting.
That's amazing that you could have that feeling really before anything grew to what it is today, because with the benefit of hindsight, it's always easy to look back and say, yeah, of course, like this was going to happen. But the fact that you were there would have been very, very interesting. So you mentioned you had no idea. So you mentioned you had really no idea what a community manager was. So could you explain what a community manager was back then, and then what a community manager is today?
I mean, to be honest with you, back then, I don't ever remember seeing a community manager in a formal role. I never remembered any company hiring. Now, I know that you're going to get an email from someone saying, I was a community manager in 1999, because there's always those folks out there who need to right the wrongs of the world, and more power to you people. But I don't remember seeing anyone. And I was really starting to get to know people at Red Hat. And, when I got started in 98, of course, like Canonical didn't exist. But what there was a lot of people who were kind of community facilitators. There were people who were just very naturally interested in the community side and very excited about the community side. And that's kind of what I was starting to get into. But there wasn't really a label for those people. And they weren't in an organized group, somewhat interestingly, because, you know, I I remember, for example, I was at university and I finished university in 2003. I had no idea what I wanted to do for a living. I'm a terrible developer. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that. And I'd ended up writing a lot of articles for magazines because I got drunk in a bar with these two guys who were starting a magazine called Linux Format. And they said, if you want to write an article for us, we'll if it's not rubbish, we'll print it, which seemed like a fair contract.
You got the napkin, wrote it out.
Right. But it was the community thing that always excited me. And what I found fascinating was that the thing that everybody always talked about at events, at Linux user group meetings, which you could now call a meetup, was the community. Everyone cherished the community. It was so special to everybody. And I remember always thinking, like, I wish I could just spend time doing community stuff. And that's when I really saw the role at Canonical. And I think what was exciting about that, because, you know, when I was at Open Advantage, I wasn't a community manager. You know, I was a consultant. I was helping people to use open source. Is that the industry started really kind of formalizing that, hey, there's loads of people out there who are really good at the community side and really interested in the community side. Let's give them a title and have them do that and get paid for it. And now it's way different. There's lots and lots of community professionals out there. There's people in developer relations and advocacy and all kinds of stuff. So, but it really was like, I mean, it's a renaissance that's happened, is how I would describe it. Like, people started writing things down and figuring out how to do it, and it's been fun.
That's very interesting. I know, just as the director of community at XPRIZE, Canonical, GitHub, you've really seen the power of community. So just for everyone listening, and also for my sake, what does it come down to? Why are communities so important?
I think communities are one of the most magical elements of being human, which might sound like a very overblown statement, and it is. But the reason why I say that is because a community it's a network of minds, you know, that comes together. It has a common interest. And that interest may be Cardi B, or it may be, you know, Kubernetes, or it may be Fortnite. But those people come together, and that network of minds has ideas and perspectives and creativity and experience, and very importantly, time, you know, to varying degrees. So if you think about it, like, you know, if Henry, if you have like a business and you've got 20 people who work there, you're limited to what you're paying for as an employer is the expertise and the time of those 20 people. And you're fundamentally capped by that. Whereas with a community, when you can motivate people around a mission, around an ethos, you can end up attracting hundreds or even thousands of people who contribute their time and expertise willingly. And that is how we can do amazing things. And I think open source is one of the most beautiful examples of that. I mean, just take a look at, for example, Firefox. You know, the web, for younger listeners, the web was a very locked down thing back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And there was a fear that Microsoft, who were a belligerent gorilla in the room at the time, were going to basically lock down all the standards and restrict what you know. So all the good stuff would happen in Internet Explorer, and Firefox was a response to that. And Firefox didn't just attract developers and, you know, documentation writers, but there were advocates all over the world. People who were making crop circles in the shape of the Mozilla Firefox logo. And,
really,
you know, people, yeah. I mean, it was incredible. Like, there was a large number of people donated to get a full page ad printed in the New York Times about the open web. It captured people's excitement and interest. And you could never do that in a company, because you'd always have to meet the profit line. You'd always have to make a profit and justify that. And when what you're doing in that case is advocacy and activism, there's not a lot of money in it. So that, to me, is what's so special about communities. The tricky thing, and part of the reason why it's ignited my interest for so many years, is communities are really hard to do. You know, they're very complicated and they're very unintuitive for, I'd say, most people. And I feel like that's a disservice to humanity. I think that, you know, everybody should have the ability to make an amazing community and do it in an easy and predictable way. And that's one of the reasons why I've devoted my life to learning from lots of other amazing people and then documenting it and providing simple ways in which people can do it and understanding the art and the science of it.
Okay, that's very interesting. I know I sort of see maybe a shift between, it used to be the enterprises, they didn't really believe in open source, and yet communities came along, and ultimately after a few decades they have won, arguably, with open source being so prevalent and just so much bigger and widely used than proprietary software. So companies now have to start taking the idea of building community around projects that have open source a lot more seriously. So around that topic, I looked online and I saw something called the Bacon method. Now, when I typed that into Google, the first thing to pop up was how to cook very, very crispy bacon in the oven. And
that's what it is.
I needed that anyway. But I dug a bit deeper, and I'm wondering if you could describe to us, what is the Bacon method?
It's so funny. So when I wrote People Powered, so the bit of backstory is I wrote a book called The Art of Community a number of years ago, back in 2008, and it's a very kind of like it's a practical guide to how to build communities. It's really intended for nerdy tech people. You know, I wrote it from a position of being a nerdy tech person, but as a consultant, I work with lots of different companies. You know, from banks to crypto companies, consumer products, services businesses. So a lot of people who would come to me and say, "Hey, we're thinking about a community," they'd often say, "Hey, I've just bought your book, The Art of Community. I'm excited to read it." And what made me nervous about that was they were going to read 10 pages and get completely stuck because it went into too much detail too quickly. So I came to the uncomfortable realization, oh God, I have to write another book. And it needs to be a business book. So I ended up writing this book called People Powered that you mentioned at the beginning. And a business book is a very, very different proposition than writing a technology book. It's a very, very exhaustive editing process. You know, it took a year to basically create it. It took me 4 months to write. Well, it took me 2.5 months to write it. But it took a year of editing because the business press takes, like, every word is carefully figured out. So part of the goal here was for people who have no idea about communities, who don't know anything about open source even potentially. How do you go from explaining the value of a community to building one in a simple and effective way? So the first bit, explaining the value, that was relatively straightforward. I can provide tons of examples of how to do that. The second piece, though, is the problem I have with a lot of business books is, frankly, they suck. Like, you buy a business book and it provides a bunch of waffly kind of principles drowned in examples. And you get to the end of it and you think, what did I actually really learn? Not a lot that I can actually put into action. It just annoys me. And I actually said to HarperCollins when we were talking about doing People Power, I was like, I don't want to write that book because I think those books suck. I want something that's high level enough for people to understand it, but really, really does give you some very, very practical things that you can do. So I had to then think about, okay, well, how do you do that? And luckily, by this point, I'd been consulting full-time for about 3 years, and I've been doing consulting on the side for about 10 years. So I developed my approach, my method. And so that's kind of forms a big chunk of People Powered is how I do that and how I recommend people do it. And I was like, the thing with business books as well is you kind of need to label all these things. Everything needs to have a name so people can reference it in discussions. So what do I call this? So I jokingly called it the Bacon method because my last name is a stupid name. Like, it's undeniable. What's even stupider than having the last name Bacon is some people think my name is Jono Bacon.
Oh,
which is ridiculous.
See, who doesn't like bacon? I can agree with that, but Jono, but yeah, okay.
So I call it the Bacon method, but I put in the first paragraph of the book, I don't really call it that. It's just kind of an amusing.
What do you call it?
I don't really have a name for it, if I'm being honest with you. But now people have started calling it the Bacon method, and my ego loves it.
A community is built around it.
Right. So, so that's kind of the basic backstory of that.
Okay, very interesting. One thing that companies have started to do now is not just keep their secret recipe, like their Coca-Cola recipe, hidden inside their company. They're open sourcing projects because there's a lot of benefits of doing that. Yeah. So can we focus on what are some best practices for companies to create, build, and engage open source communities around the open source projects, their own open source projects?
So you're talking about if they're running their own project, they're running
their own projects and it's open source, yeah.
Yeah, what a great question. So there's, I mean, as you can probably imagine, there's a lot to talk about here. I think the first thing is judging the point of it all. If I'm being honest with you, there are some people, I actually wrote a blog post about this, that open source, it's not a panacea, right? An open source won't make a terrible product or a terrible project successful. Open source is an amazing developer methodology to help people collaborate effectively around things that they care about. But people have got to care about that thing in the first place. So the question I would have first of all is, who is your target audience that you have for this project? And what is the value of the project? What is it going to do for them? And I always like to start that value proposition by evaluating with your target audience, what do they hate about their lives? What sucks for them? And how can your project relieve that pain, relieve that frustration for them? So for example, one of the reasons why Kubernetes has been so successful is because it really simplifies broad scale deployments, right? Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why Ubuntu, when I joined, became so successful was because, at least on the desktop, it was a lot easier to use and things just seemed to work compared to some of the competitors. Mm-hmm. So that to me is the first step. And being clear about that. I think the second thing is really simplifying the onboarding experience for how people get started. And you can break that into two pieces. One is going to be the onboarding experience for people to use your software, right? So sadly, all too often, the onboarding experience is you stumble on the project at GitHub. There is a kind of fairly poorly crafted readme.md file that walks through some elements of what the project is. And then you've got to kind of figure it out like some kind of annoying Rubik's Cube. And that's not the way to do it. Like Microsoft had this principle that a friend of mine, Steve Wally, told me about. And I think he called it the shrink wrap gap, which is within 10 minutes of taking the shrink wrap off a piece of boxed software, this is back in the early days, you have to get some kind of value out of it within 10 minutes. That's how long you've got. And I think open source projects need to do the same thing. Like, how do you easily get someone up and running, like downloading it and deploying it and using it, and then getting some value out of it within 10 minutes? And that's an installation piece, but that's also like a how do you get started and do something piece. So that's kind of one piece of the onboarding. But the other piece of the onboarding is then how do you get people to contribute and participate in your project? Mm-hmm. And that's more complicated because they're going to need to set up the tool chain and be able to build it and know what to work on. But I think the key thing there is put yourself in the position of somebody who is brand new, like flip your brain into private browsing mode and look at it through their eyes, and then figure out like what are the different pieces. And at each step of the way, say, is this obvious? So for example, if step one is going to be build the software so you can actually write code, ask yourself the question, is it obvious how to build this? No? Well, now it's time to write some documentation or simplify it. So that to me is really important, because too many projects, and the open source world is very guilty of this, is they have really excited people who go out and kind of waffle on about it on social media and mailing lists and elsewhere and get people excited about the software and focus a lot on the outreach, but then they don't do the homework of getting the onboarding piece in place, first of all. And I think that's really critical. And then finally, just building a relationship with your audience. Like when projects are very small, this is pretty straightforward because you can often just know everybody. But the reason why people join open source projects is not because they just want to build great software and they want to solve interesting technology problems. It's because they enjoy the human interaction. They enjoy the sense of team spirit and camaraderie. And we need to be intentional about that. And it's easy to, with the best of intentions, forget that because we get busy with other stuff. Like, you're in your email all day, you got stuff to do, your family's, needs you. You're nerding out over the latest PS5 news, and you don't have time to tap someone on the shoulder and say, "Hey, how's it going? Are you having a good time with the project? Is there anything I can help with?" We've got to be intentional about that stuff.
I think that it definitely gets lost, especially when open source projects start to grow and grow and grow. It's not just the issue list that grows, but it's the inability, I guess, to touch everyone or make everyone feel welcome. A lot of these projects, at least a lot of maintainers I've talked to, they struggle with that.
I agree, Henry. Totally agree. Yeah.
Throughout your tenure or your time in open source, what are some open source projects that you think have the most thriving communities that you've observed? And I'm talking more about, actually, let's just go with open source projects.
Oh, great question. So I think there's a number of good examples here. I mean, Kubernetes is killing it right now. They're doing an amazing job.
Incredible.
And just frankly, the overall Cloud Native Computing Foundation kind of ecosystem is doing a really good job. There's lots of projects that live in that fishbowl. I think Debian has always been a very long-standing, great example of community, and they've experienced the true test of time. They can be a bit of a grumpy bunch from time to time, but that's what you get when you have people who've been doing something for a long time. Is there's kind of ways of doing things, and people like to stay within those ways of doing things, which, by the way, can be a problem for certain projects. Is kind of changing gears a little bit. But Debian's done a fabulous job. I think Apache have done an amazing job. I think there's many foundations that have been doing a great job as well, like the Apache Foundation, I think the Open Source Initiative. I mean, the Linux Foundation, I think, are doing amazing work. I'm a little biased to the Linux Foundation because A, they're a client, and B, Jim Zemlin, who runs the Linux Foundation, is a good friend of mine. But I think they've filled a very important gap of making the open source world to be a really palatable place for a lot of businesses, large businesses who have no idea about how any of this stuff works. And you kind of need an endpoint for that, and just kind of facilitating those projects. Another great example that I have a real soft spot for is a project called Blender, and it's a 3D graphics tool.
Yes, very popular.
Yeah, it's amazing. And part of the reason why I have a soft spot is when I was starting out in my career, Blender used to be owned by a company called Not a Number, and then it was open source. Ton Roosendahl, who's the creator of Blender, essentially bought the rights to it off the company, and then open sourced it and built a community around it. And I remember I can't remember why he did this, but he invited me to go and speak at one of the first Blender conferences in Amsterdam. And I met that group of people, and I'm not an artist. I have the artistic talent of a rubber hammer. But they were just such a nice group of people. And I've actually just reconnected with Blender recently, reconnected with Ton. And they've done amazing work. I mean, they're just an incredible community out there. So lots of good examples.
Well, thank you for that. That was great. And I definitely always see Blender on the open source subreddit. It just continuously pops up. And that's how I knew there's a strong community. So I'm a company. I have a project that I've just open sourced. There is value in it. There's definitely a problem that I think a lot of users out there, they want to solve, and they have that need. And we've made it easy to onboard. Where do I start, and how do I go about attracting people to that community?
So I think we can break this into two pieces. One is going to be users, and then one's going to be contributors. Yes. I think you always want to start with users, because at least in my career so far, I've never seen anyone become a contributor of an open source project without being a user first. Yeah, I think those people probably exist, and they're weird people. Why would you do that?
Just for fun.
Just like a Batman style figure who just swoops into a project, submits a pull request, and vanishes. I don't know. Maybe there's some interesting people out there. I think it all boils down to value. Like, one thing I bang on about constantly certainly in People Power, but also just in videos and books, articles, and whatever else, is the importance of value. Like, everything to me is about value. Human beings are mercenary creatures. We're not going to do something unless we can get something out of it, right? So the key thing, I think, is explaining what the value of your project is. The problem with a lot of tech people that tech people are guilty of is tech people are by definition interested in features. Like, we talk about specifications, capabilities, technical specification sheets. We're interested in all that kind of stuff. But when you're talking to people who are new to something, you have to talk about the benefits. You have to talk about what is going to be beneficial to them, and how is it going to benefit their lives. So to use a comparison, imagine you're selling a car, right? The tech folks will probably talk about, the speed and the wheel rim size and, what the entertainment systems in it and the suspension, all that kind of stuff. But for the people who are brand new, what they want to know about is, how is this car how am I gonna use it in terms of my comfort, in terms of my commute, in terms of how it's going to make me feel. Those are the things we should talk about. So I think it's important, first of all, to emphasize the value clearly. The second thing I think is really critical as well is to build a relationship with your users that is long lasting, right? So the problem here is a lot of businesses and a lot of projects, what they do is they say, hey, go and use our project and then come and hang out in our Slack channel or join our forum or something like that. And, if you build it, they will come, doesn't work. I'd like it to work. It would make my job a lot easier, but it doesn't work. So what we need to do is we need to give them a regular drip feed of stuff that's valuable, right? So, to give you an example, one of the things for until, when was it? February, I thought email marketing was a complete waste of time because the vast majority of the email I get in my inbox is crap. It's really, really beautifully designed coupon codes. And I just ignore it. It's people desperately trying to sell me stuff. But then I've been kind of exploring a lot around digital marketing, and I'm doing some work in this area with my own business where I'm making some expanding out into a few different markets. So I thought I should probably do some email. And I thought, what's the kind of stuff that I want to read, right? So I decided to focus on just sharing like best practice and guidance. So you mentioned at the beginning of this episode, people who sign up for the book club or sign up for the pack, they will get added to my email. And the only emails you're really going to get are going to be almost like articles that I send you. It's best practice, it's guidelines, it's practical things that will be useful. And I discovered
people appreciate that.
Yeah, that the open rates and the click rates go through the roof.
Yeah.
And that's a great way of nurturing a relationship with people in an automated way. So I think if you set up a project, you start a business, make sure you get people, have a place where you bring them together, but then also you give them really good stuff. It's a heavy content play, but it's really important. One thing that VCs always say to me over and over again that they have a problem with new founders is that founders always regret they get their first round of customers and then they treat them like princes and princesses, and then they go for the second round and they expand out and they don't spend enough time with that first round and then they leave. And we can't do that in open source. We got to give them that. We got to have that relationship. So yeah, that's probably what I'd focus on first. Yeah, okay. Nurture is what it's all about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now that we've focused on companies open sourcing their own projects, that's not only the way that companies can come involved with open source communities. There's also contributing back to open source projects that you use. And it is definitely a trend. Companies are starting to do that a lot more these days. Is it primarily because they want to influence the project to meet their needs in some way? Or why are companies doing that?
I think there's a few different reasons, and it depends on the company. So, for example, for large businesses like Microsoft, like I mentioned earlier on, that Microsoft were kind of the gorilla stomping around, getting all upset with everybody back in the early days of open source.
Microsoft is a cancer. Sorry, open source is a cancer, they said.
Open source is a cancer. Yeah. Unbelievable.
Now an open source first company.
Right, exactly. I mean, they are huge participants in the open source world. But you're gonna get some emails, Henry, from people who spell Microsoft with a $sign inside of it. You're gonna be like, never ever forgive. Never forgive. Like, come on, forgive,
forget.
Forgive, forget, live, love.
Live, love, life.
Exactly. And drink loads of gin. So I think that for companies like Microsoft, one of the reasons why they participate in a lot of open source projects is because they really have high level like infrastructure requirements, and they'd have to build that code themselves and then maintain it. So their philosophy is, why don't we just build it out in the open? We'll put it into these projects, and then it becomes something that everybody can value and benefit from, and it becomes a shared burden when it comes to security and maintenance and things like that. And that's one of the reasons why I think open source has been especially popular in the infrastructure world, where you get companies like Microsoft and Dell and Amazon and Google, and all of these businesses who have to scale up infrastructure to such a massive degree as the cloud has become popular and everybody's building businesses now that are online. Like when was the last time you downloaded an application to use it? Like it's just old school now, like Photoshop maybe, but even that's going online. So they've had to react, and that's a big burden. So that's where I think they can do that in open source. Now, there are other companies and smaller companies, especially in early stage startups that have maybe got their first round of funding from a VC. Often what they want to do is they want to kind of be a bit of a force in the open source world, so they can build an open source business around it. There's been a really popular trend towards what are called open core companies recently, where they have an open source project and then they kind of have commercial services that sit on top of it, and open source then becomes a market for them. But frankly, the companies that succeed, the companies that primarily succeed there are the ones that are doing it for the right reasons. They want to build great products, want to build great tech. If they're only doing it to raise brand awareness, then it's just like brand marketing. It becomes a very expensive exercise that you can't really measure. So,
okay, no, that was great. Thank you. And I know one thing just on that note, similar just on the contribution side, I know that you have to be very, very careful as an enterprise going in and getting involved with the community, because open source communities in particular don't want Big Brother or someone to come in and control them and take ownership. So what are some best practices for companies that are using an open source project and they want to contribute back? How can they best start integrating with that community?
I think the first step is go and mingle and spend time and understand them first, because communities are subcultures, right? And there are a set of cultural norms that apply there. And the thing about culture is you can't teach culture, you can't enforce culture. Culture is the set of rules that the people decide, right? So there's no, well, there may be a law around this, but there's no law stating that I can't go to my downtown in my local town dressed as a peacock, screaming Latin at people. There's no law that says that. Well, there probably is.
It could be.
But one of the reasons why I don't do that is, one, I'm not insane, but two is it would be a real social faux pas to do that.
Yeah.
So and there's these variances within these different communities. So go and hang out and just watch and learn. And one of the great benefits of open source is it's not like many other industries where you can't do your research. With open source, because we live out in the open, you can go and read the discussions, read the pull requests, go and read the mailing list discussions, read the Slack channels, and go and understand and see it and ask people about it first. So when you kind of go into that community, you can kind of figure out how it's going. I think many businesses, frankly, are nervous about this because they always hear these horror stories of how prickly some open source people can be. And you only have to say one thing wrong and some dude with a neckbeard is going to hit you to come down on you on Twitter. And I think, to be honest with you, that's largely untrue. There are a couple of grumpy, miserable individuals, but you get that in any group of people. I found that the open source community is a very, very friendly, diverse, wonderful place to be. But yeah, do your research first of all. And then I think just start simple, like go and do something that's small. Like for example, Sun many years ago got into a bit of hot water because they open sourced Star Office and it became Open Office. And it was just dumped on the internet as a code dump. And they were thinking, oh, this is great. Like we're open sourcing this. Aren't we good citizens? But a code dump means you have to go, and that's a lot of work for people to figure out how that works. Yeah. So that, for example, is a faux pas in the open source world. It would be better to go and start with something small, build a relationship, and then do something a little bit bigger, build relationships. So just kind of dip your toes in, and get warm to the water, and then you'll be fine.
I think, that piece of advice to have small increments, because I know, like you said, with the code dump, we definitely I've seen that at Quantsite, which is an Open Teams partner. Travis Oliphant, the founder of Open Teams, also founded Quantsite, and it's piecemeal, because if you just chuck everything in, then it's likely it's not going to be accepted. So start with something small, build it up. I think that's very, very, very valuable advice. But companies obviously really are focused on the bottom line. Well, executives are focused on the bottom line, yet people understand how important open source is. So how do you convince an executive who wants to know that this is worth doing, contributing back to this community is worth doing? In other words, what is the ROI? How do you measure the ROI of your involvement with an open source community?
Good question. I mean, and that frankly will vary quite significantly. So I can share a few thoughts, but I think it would need to really be tied quite specifically to that individual company. Let's take an example. Let's imagine somebody is, let's say they're a bank, right? And they're deploying a service to the internet, and they use a bunch of open source components, and their engineers are saying, we'd like to build something new that this project doesn't do. We feel like we should then contribute it into this particular project. Let's say it's Kubernetes again, as an example. And the executive saying, like, why are we doing this? Like, why can't somebody else build this for us? Like, why can't we sell this? The first thing I would say is the maintenance burden is significantly reduced. Is that it's much easier to maintain that at that particular point. So it lowers the cost of overall infrastructure management. Your security posture is improved because projects that are open source tend to be very, very secure because, more eyeballs are looking for bugs and therefore looking for security vulnerabilities, and it makes you more secure. The other thing I would say is if this bank, let's say, is interested in building a closer relationship with the open source community, there are many benefits to that in terms of hiring, recruiting people in to work on your infrastructure, your technology. Also kind of building relationships as a brand that's known and well respected in the open source world, which again can help with recruiting, but also potentially help with sales. So let's say this is a bank that has a series of cloud APIs for people to interface with their mobile payments, as an example. And a lot of the companies that would be buying that service or paying for that service maybe are active in the open source world. Well, again, that kind of sets you up as a very, very prominent, well-respected technical leader because you're a prominent part of the open source world. Let's say you're sponsoring conferences, you're speaking at events, you're contributing actively to open source projects. It positions your brand in a really positive way. The good news, I think, is that more and more business leaders are pretty savvy towards open source, at least in the technology, infrastructure, and services world. What we're starting to see more of is people, kind of on the edges who are less familiar with this, who are now figuring it out. People in art and sciences and consumer products and gaming and things like that. They're the ones who are now saying, like, what is this open source thing? It's just a bunch of hippies hanging out at a drum circle and writing software. Like,
they're taking over.
Right, exactly. It's weaponized yoga is what it is. So yeah, that's there's many benefits. But again, I think the key is if you're gonna have that conversation, is those are kind of generic benefits, but you got to tie it specifically to what that organization is seeking to achieve. Like, so I would broach that by saying to the person, like, what are your goals? Like, what are your top 4 things that you want to achieve with this business? And then let's see how the work being done in an open source way can serve those goals. And if they can't serve those goals, then you shouldn't do it. But it's very rare that it wouldn't serve those goals. So,
yeah. One thing too, I think we always talk about at Open Teams is the idea that you're not just saving money now, whether it's maintenance or other costs, you're saving money in the future because you don't have to maintain this thing indefinitely. And that's one thing I think a lot of companies at least forget about is it's not just the short term that you're saving money, it's going to be the long term. So I'd like to shift gears again. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say also, the pizza's good at our conferences as well. So, that's one of the other reasons.
That's enough of an excuse to get me there.
The beer's good, the pizza's good. Sold.
Sold.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Henry. You go back to the serious, important, meaningful content, and I'll continue to distract you.
Pizza is serious. Are you saying pizza's not serious?
That's a good point. Pizza is serious. Sorry, pizza. Gods of pizza.
I don't know if you follow the Barstools. They they do pizza reviews all around the country. It's really, really interesting. Just seeing all the different restaurants. Yeah, I follow them largely just for that reason because you get to see all the different types of pizzas and where you can get the best pizzas. But That's
Now I
something
want
really
a
interesting.
pizza. Okay.
I'm going to get a pizza for lunch. It's only 7:47 here in Australia, but I'll get a pizza for lunch.
7:47 a.m.
AM, yes.
Oh my God. Thank you for getting
It's,
up early for this, by the way. You're a pro.
No, my time is usually I get up at 4:30 now these days, so I can make half a day in the US just for a short period of time.
4:30.
But 4:30, I know. But I thought
that's not insane.
I thought it would be difficult, and I never expected I'd be that person. But it's fine if you get your 7-8 hours in. You wake up. I usually leave my alarm play for about 5 minutes, just sitting there until I'm annoyed and I have to get up and turn the alarm off. But it's
oh yeah.
What I love about it is by the time that everyone else starts, I've already got half a day under me of work. And then you've got a whole extra day.
Bed? What time do you get?
So between 8 and 9.
Oh,
so quite early. Yeah, I'd never done that in my life. I don't think I've ever done that. And I was usually at 12 or 1 a.m. But I guess I just got to adjust to the circumstances now.
It can be done. You're an inspiration to all of us, Henry.
Exactly.
I've tried to do that in the past, and I've
get up at 4:30.
Miserable.
Yeah, it's a discipline about going to bed early. I think I'm in lockdown now in a hotel, so I've got nothing else to do. There's no excuse. So I thought it's been good to get these routines, but
you're our very own Snowden. So
exactly,
and we respect you for this, Henry. Your lockdown responsibility.
I've got 4 days left. I'm counting the seconds.
Right.
One thing I wanted to quickly focus on before we wrap up is a big movement which a lot of companies have been focusing on lately and really seeing a lot of value out of implementing it, and that is Innersource. So can you explain what is Innersource and how does it relate to open source?
Yeah, so the idea of Innersource is that you take the methodology and the approach of open source and you apply that inside of a business within the walls of that business, right? So again, let's use a bank as an example. And I've worked with a couple of different banks in helping them with their Innersource strategy. They don't want to put open source outside. This is going to be technology that they're building for their products, for their customers. Technology that would be inappropriate to put out there for lots of different reasons. But they look at open source and they're like, this is a really great way to work. Like it's developers across the business having access to the same code. It's a consistent method of contribution and participation. It's open workflow and collaboration. It's decisions being made in an online setting and documented in an online setting instead of drafty meeting rooms. It's all of those different pieces. And it's a really, really, really powerful model. We often look at open source as the code. That's the really valuable bit of it. But for me, ever since I first got interested in this, the most exciting piece is the method, the approach. It's the collaboration piece. And arguably that's part of the reason for that is I think it's so important is because I'm a nerd when it comes to communities and collaboration.
You're a community man.
Right, right. But it's bringing that into the organization. So a lot of businesses have been very excited about this, like Bosch and Santander and Deutsche Bank and Huawei and Sony and all kinds of businesses have done this. But it's and it seems like an easy thing to think about. Like if you know open source, then you could go and work in a business and do it. But it's really, really hard work. And the reason why is because you may have an executive team who wants to move to an Innersource model, and your engineers will almost certainly want to have a more free and open way of working rather than the command and control culture of many of these big businesses. The big challenge is the middle management layer. It's the people who've got all of the responsibility and the resources, and frankly, not a lot of the power. And it's getting them into a different cultural and technological mindset and approach. So it's really rewarding when you pull it off, but it's hard work to do well.
How do you do it? Do you hire someone internally? Do you go to Jono Bacon Consulting? What is the best way for a company? And what are the best practices? I thought I'd give you a plug there, but
the only solution here, by the way, is Jono Bacon Consulting.
It's Jono Bacon Consulting. There's no other solution.
There's no other solution. Ding.
Every other, ding, ding, ding.
I think what you need is first of all, you need to empower. You need someone who owns the project. You need somebody who's going to facilitate that growth in the company in moving to an open source model. I think the key thing is you got to start small. and simple and get some wins. If you show up and you design this big complicated, let's say you design this big complicated system and it's like, all right, we're all going to have our code in this internal GitHub or GitLab repository, and this, you all now have to work this way, you're not going to succeed. So what you need to do is you need to start small, and it could be one project in an internal GitHub repo, for example, or GitLab, and just get people contributing code within that one team in an open way. And then maybe attract a couple of other developers in there and they can start doing it. And you provide training and guidance and things like that. The key is that when you do this, when you come up with that initial first idea, that really lightweight idea, is you've got to get all of your different teams who it impacts part of the process of designing how it's going to work. If you go in, if you're a community person or an Innersource person, you design the new way of working, even if it's super lightweight, and then you basically go and tell people to do it, you won't succeed. They need to see their fingerprints on it. So the engineering manager, for example, needs to feel like he or she helped to shape it, and then you're more likely to be successful. But what it also needs is it needs your execs to be very clear that this is something that's important to the business. The big challenge with Innersource is that people, developers love the idea of doing it, but one, they've got other things that they need to do that they know their manager considers to be more important. Yeah. And two, they need to have the time to do it. Like, it's unfair to ask one of your employees to work late to work in your Innersource code. So that requires you being able to say, okay, if we want to do Innersource, that means that we're not doing something else. And what is that other thing? So you need to set the expectations very clearly from your executive team that Innersource is important, and the middle management layer should expect to make time for it. And the middle management layer should set the expectations that some things won't get done, or things will get done late at a later milestone to make time for it. But then you also need to really reward and celebrate those people internally who do it. So when your first couple of developers start doing it, you want to shower them with validation and affection and gifts and whatever else. So other people in the social grouping, which is that business, know that that's something they should be doing too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This is where we're going to wrap up. I've really enjoyed talking with you. It's good to have another accent on the podcast. And it was a great conversation. Thanks for your insight. Yeah, exactly. Make sure I'm going to get a pizza. Is pizza still in my head? Can I have pizza for breakfast? Is that okay?
You know what? I think this is innovation. We've read all about innovation in those business books, right? And sure, it can be, I don't know, Kanban or whatever, but I think eating pizza for breakfast, that comes under the banner of innovation.
Yeah, I think I'm going to. I get one Uber Eats order a day in this prison, so I'm going to use that on a pizza.
I love it.
But yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And
likewise.
Make sure you go out and get the book, People Powered, and sign up to the book club, because I think that's an amazing opportunity to be able to learn something. I know I was reading through the reviews and people said it's a book you need to read twice. One, to go through all the theory and understand it. The second, to understand how you can actually put it into practice. So go out and get the book. And I know you also run 2 podcasts. What are the 2 podcasts that people can find you at and want to hear your voice?
Yeah, so one is called Bad Voltage, which is 2 idiot friends and I talking about tech and open source.
Nice.
And then the other one is Conversations with Bacon, where I just interview people, like a long form, and kind of like this, just a long form conversation for an hour. And it's, I've had it's a really broad variety of people, from Mark Shuttleworth, who runs Canonical, to the CEO of Meetup.com, to a guy who's a VC of psychedelics, someone who invented a hangover cure, executive coaches, all kinds of people. Yeah, just interesting conversation.
That's awesome. And to those of you who are watching this on YouTube, then please like the video and also subscribe and leave a comment. Let us know what you think. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or a different platform, then please leave a review and let us know how we're doing and what kind of content you'd like to see. So thank you very much for everyone for listening. Thank you, Jono, and stay safe, everyone. Until next time.